thank you all for being here. I'm very glad to see that Lucas changed from his black outfit. I was worried I was the only one who hadn't received the memo. But we're joined here by a few fantastic founders. Stanley hosted us last year for MAVIS, so we're back in the same venue. And we're going to be talking about DeFi. I think a lot of us have seen what's happened in the past week with FTX and sort of centralized entities. Some of the core lessons really should be that we can take some reassurance in sort of heavily regulated centralized entities. We should be able to take a lot more reassurance from decentralized, transparent entities that don't even need to be regulated as a result. But really what we should not be taking any reassurance from is centralized and unregulated entities. But this panel should really be about decentralized, transparent financial entities and networks and all the benefits they can bring. So maybe we can start with a set of intros. Simon, why don't you go first, talking about yourself, what you're building, and then we go this way.
Sure. So, can you hear me? Yeah, sure. So I'm Simon. I am the CEO and co-founder of Volts Labs. At Volts Labs, we've built Volts Protocol, which is what we describe as an interest rate swap AMM. So for anybody who's familiar with traditional finance, you'll know that interest rate swaps is one of the biggest markets in the world. There's actually a cartoonishly large quadrillion of notional exchanged each year in TradFi IRS. And before we launched Volts, that number in DeFi was 0. But more importantly, what it enables for DeFi is if you kind of zoom out at the most macro level, what an interest rate swap unlocks is it enables you to move from something that is variable and volatile to something that is fixed and therefore stable. And therefore, at the most macro level, what it has enabled is it has enabled stability to exist throughout the ecosystem, meaning we have massively expanded the potential financial needs that DeFi can serve. And we launched about 5 months ago, and we've been growing about 30% a week since.
Hello, GM. First of all, nice to see a lot of people here. I was expecting with the FTX that no one would show up, but apparently, like, decentralized finance is something that you all believe in. So my name is Stani. I'm the founder and CEO of Aave, and Aave is a team that built the Aave protocol. And it's a protocol where you can supply cryptographic assets and earn yield on those assets, and at the same time use them as a collateral to borrow liquidity, to finance a goal. So for example, you might hold cryptographic assets, might be Ethereum, might be some other tokens, and you don't want to spend them, and you want to finance a goal, might be an investment, paying for tuition, a car, or even a mortgage. The Aave protocol has been deployed originally in the Ethereum network, and now is living on multiple networks cross-chain, including Polygon, Avalanche, and layer 2s like Optimism and Arbitrum. Very exciting thing about the protocol is that it's governed by the Aave community, so the Aave DAO, meaning that the founding team, means us and some of the people in the crowd, can't go and change the code arbitrarily. So whatever we program and the community decided to change, that will stick there. And in overall, with the Aave team, we didn't expect DeFi to grow to some extent that it is today. So the protocol is securing roughly from 5 to 15 billion worth of value on the smart contracts at the moment, depending on the market fluctuations. And as a company, we build Web3, meaning that we are excited about building access. With Aave protocol, it means access to finance, global markets, transparency, and more recently with Lens protocol, we've been building access to your ownership of your social capital and with social media. Super happy to be here. I'm originally from Helsinki, and nice to see my fellow Legions visiting Helsinki as well, and especially this particular venue because indeed it was the venue for Aave, which our team is also known about hosting decentralized parties. Super excited to be here.
Yeah, good intro, Stani. Hello, my name is Lucas. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Centrifuge. As we're building this governed by code, decentralized financial ecosystem, what Centrifuge is doing is we're bringing real-world assets into it. So we really want to open this up for the whole world, meaning borrowers from all around to use the collateral that they have. So real estate, trade finance, invoices, really anything you can imagine that like exists today, right? Just broadly, and use that as collateral to access liquidity, right? In a way that they can do so without banks, much more direct lending and borrowing from each other. We launched in 2019, kind of creating the first, bringing the first real-world assets on chain, kind of creating tranches for the first time in DeFi, allowing kind of like investors to invest in like high-risk junior tranches, more stable, lower return senior tranches, kind of like building the first like way for these assets to come on, and then ultimately what we believe in strongly and have been working towards for a very long time was integrating these real assets that exist off-chain into other DeFi protocols. So we went live very early with Maker as collateral. So now these users that are borrowing money don't just have access to DeFi, but can mint their own DAI with it. And then also more recently, we've launched an integration with Aave. So actually, you can use the Aave protocol to lend to real-world assets. I believe this integration, this composability is really what makes DeFi magic and what will allow us really here to build this new future that we are trying to make into existence.
Yeah, thank you. So my name is Miao. I'm a co-founder and CTO of Superfluid. What we do is that we are a programmable, composable, and streamable token that is live currently on 6 EVM chains. We strive for composability, and we allow people to build on top of our protocol in order to create, let's say, real-time finance, we call it, type of applications. So you could not only, we're known for streaming salaries, but that's just a starting point. But because we're programmable, because we're composable, we allow people to build things like dollar cost average in streams also. In a not so distant future, we also want to make it interoperable so that you could send move money across chains, maybe even across different chains, including non-EVM chains, as kind of composable money stream. So that's our long-term vision. So, but currently we're live on 6 EVM chains, and you're welcome to try it out on app.superfluidfinance. And I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for inviting. Yeah.
Amazing. Thanks for all those intros. So now, if we go into one of the sort of timely topics mentioned before, FTX, Alameda, the whole breakdown of sort of centralized custodians and exchanges that were able to possibly misuse customer funds. Maybe one of you can start with a quick intro. Maybe Stanley, given you have the closest alternative in a decentralized fashion as a business, but maybe you can give us a 30-second overview of, in your view, what happened, and then I'd love all of us to really go into what are the sort of the stronger case for DeFi that has emerged from this? What has even become more interesting now over the past week for distributed, transparent protocols to take on these centralized entities?
Yeah, I mean, with the what happened with FTX was definitely quite tragic for crypto space in the sense that you know, with FTX, a lot of people trust centralized exchanges. So it's for many it's a onboarding way to actually you know, decentralized economy and following the space, participating, maybe holding some of the assets and coins. And I think like what happened with FTX was like the simplest answer is that the exchange and the owners were using customer funds basically to trade with them and to make profit and taking excessive risk. Now, I mean, the problem with FTX also is kind of like continuation what we had previously with 3 Euro Capital that basically over-leveraged their positions, same with BlockFi and same with Celsius. So one of the things that is a kind of like a same ingredient for all of these service providers that are in the crypto space is that they pretty much operate like a black box, right? So you really don't see what's happening, how much leverage is taken, are your customer funds actually safe? And it's a big problem because decentralized finance has existed maybe for the past 2 years in the current form where we have actually people that are using day-to-day DeFi. And for me, it was a bit of surprise as well because I personally haven't used centralized exchanges for 2 years. And there's this kind of like a parallel narrative that we build a lot of products in decentralized finance. There's a very easy way to swap assets. For example, you can go to Uniswap or Balancer, click a button, confirm the transaction, and you made an actual swap from one asset to another. Depositing to the other protocols, the centrifuge pools, and and streaming money and swapping interest rate even those things are easy. But coming into this ecosystem is the hardest place, and that's where a lot of the normies are actually onboarding, and that's where the service providers are kind of like they have to use the service providers. And I think what's been very challenging for the space is that we talk a lot about decentralized finance, how important it is, and it's actually very valuable infrastructure because it really opens up visibility into how these protocols and how your finances are within the DeFi space. So you could actually quantify the whole exposure within the, not just Aave protocol, but like the whole ecosystem, how much stablecoins are minted, where they are, what kind of rules they're bound in, transparently, and you have traceability. And the biggest kind of like a challenge is that there's a lot of innovation happening on the DeFi frontier, but it's usually the centralized service providers that are actually taking the innovation a bit back. And that's why I was asking previously and wondering, like, there's so many people here. So either you're here like getting more answers about FTX, or either you are actually, you want to fix the problem. And I think that's what everyone here is about.
Yeah, maybe to add to that, one of the things that I think it really highlighted for me is if you massively zoom out, like how do you create a financial system? And what we've had historically is that you have centralized entities that act as the gatekeeper really to the entire financial system. But those centralized entities, they are opaque, they've got potential for massive incentive misalignment. And what that means is it means that every now and then you have these kind of huge systemic events which ultimately result in the entity kind of going bust, which hurts the people who have put their money with that entity. And the solution to that historically is, frankly, just to kind of regulate as much as you can. But the problem with that really is that innovation or regulation almost by definition always lags innovation. So you're always going to have innovation that's ahead of the regulators, which at times kind of results in these huge systemic events like 2008 global financial crisis, kind of what most recently has happened with FTX and the rest of the CeFi ecosystem. And that's kind of like one option. And I think what's really exciting is with the emergence of DeFi, we actually have a genuine alternative of how to create a financial system. And what's so exciting about DeFi is in many ways it addresses a lot of those limitations associated with centralized entities. So instead of having the institutions acting as the gatekeeper, you as an individual, you have self-custody over your own assets. Instead of having these opaque structures, you have transparent open source protocols, which means that you are always able to kind of go in and read the rules of the system and know how that works. And then alongside that, there's actually like safeguards that exist, like to one of Stanley's points earlier, like the protocols are permissionless. To change the protocol, the DAO has to vote in order to change the code. So you kind of know that someone's not going to go in and just change something, which is then going to kind of affect those like rules that you're effectively signed up to. And I think the challenge for us now is like FTX and the rest of CeFi kind of imploding. It's kind of a massively sad event, and it's sad because it has affected so many people. But what we need to do is we need to try and help educate people on the differences between CeFi and TradFi and just centralized entities more generally versus DeFi, and try and improve the onboarding experience into DeFi, right? Which is kind of to Stanley's point earlier, the CeFi institutions were the onboarding point, which meant that whilst DeFi is better, for the majority of people, you are inheriting the limitations of centralized entities.
So I think there's a lot of sort of hurdles that still exist. You mentioned some of them around sort of the on-ramps, the possibility to bring new users in. One of the other ones that's probably quite relevant is that when we're talking about DeFi, historically at least, we've largely talked about assets that were purely sort of on-chain native, that didn't really exist off-chain. But ultimately, the majority of people, the large amount of assets that they own, that they touch, that they want to sort of use in financial ecosystems are off-chain. They are real-world assets, as another term. That's what you really deal with, Lucas. So maybe you can talk about how do you deal with real-world assets? How do you bring them on-chain? How do you create that sort of legal anchoring from an off-chain world to an on-chain world? How do you deal with redemptions, with possible deterioration of those assets? We're starting with things like unpaid invoices, but I think you'll be looking a lot further than that very soon.
So like real-world assets, there's obviously something that you're taking. Say you use the example of an invoice. What we do is we basically have a combination of both like a lot of legal work and a lot of technical work to create a token that, as a user, you can own it, and you know that there is an asset that's backing it, and if in case something does go wrong, you have a legal recourse. The way we do this is actually very boring, very old school, in that it's done at every other fund, every credit fund in the world, every bank in the world, they use these same legal tools. You create a company, you put all of the assets in there. So if I want to finance my invoice, I pledge the invoice to the company. If an investor wants to actually finance put money into this pool of invoices, then they effectively enter into a legal agreement, and when they acquire the tokens, they now have an interest in the company, right? And then you're basically using the on-chain to accrue interest, to manage your redemptions, your investments, to kind of like then maybe leverage or borrow against, use as collateral these tokens, but the legal recourse exists in the real world, meaning in case anything goes wrong, you can make use of the exact same tools, right? So a bankruptcy court would honor the fact that you own these tokens, because in the legal framework that is used to create this pool, basically it says, instead of you signing a contract and buying some shares, it's you own some tokens in your wallet. That means that this is how you define your legal rights. And this is something that, like, depending on which country in the world, like, of course there are many differences, but it's something that we've been able to do with a Hong Kong entity, with US entities. US is where most of our legal assets are actually kind of the legal jurisdictions that we use. But it's typically, there's actually quite a bit of compatibility. And so that makes it actually quite easy for us to move these assets on chain. The harder part is to make sure that within DeFi we can find regulatory compliant ways to then go into Maker or go into Aave, and that's really where we're probably going to get out of scope for this panel, but a lot of our legal work has been.
Got it. And I guess that sort of ties nicely into sort of back to Aave now, in terms of getting a lot of that regulatory work done, a lot of that compliance work done. As you're bringing real-world assets, you're probably also bringing sort of off-chain institutions on-chain who are starting to finance some of your products. How do you deal with institutions that might be large corporates or banks? There's been some recent examples that you can probably talk about. How does that look? What are the sort of core hurdles there? And how do you, on a timeline basis, how long do you think that will take until you have every major bank in the world that's providing capital on Aave?
Yeah, I think the institutional game is definitely like the long game. So, you see a lot of adoption in DeFi amongst the enthusiasts. So a lot of people here that are now, for example, or people that might work in institutions already, but they're curious enough about finance and the future of finance to actually use decentralized protocols and actually innovate or even participate in governance. So I think there's a lot of excitement around traditional finance about what capabilities decentralized finance has, and also idea of building on top of open networks and what kind of innovation it can actually drive. I think then when it comes to the actual institutions, that's something that takes a lot of time. So we've been working with institutions for the past couple of years, educating mostly about what is decentralized finance, why it's important to build the future of financial infrastructure that is seen as a public good, and building into it on a transparent public network where anyone can actually have the visibility, auditability, you can trace funds, and also you can actually innovate as anyone, whoever you are, across different parts of the world. So there's definitely a lot of benefits to it. Obviously, the hardest part is to get those institutions to actually have a buy-in into the technology. And in most cases, it's because it's very early. If you go just 2 years back, I think there wasn't even the term of, well, 3 years maybe, there wasn't the term coined of decentralized finance and DeFi. It was very early dApps, decentralized applications where you could earn yield. And even 4 years back, there wasn't a stable coin on Ethereum, which as Ethereum was the first virtual machine, basically programmable computer on the blockchain that you could do different kinds of applications. So we're still very early on the adoption curve, even like on the enthusiast level, but especially on the institutional level. There's been recent progress for sure. We launched over a year ago the Aave Arc Market, which is effectively using the same infrastructure that we have deployed on Ethereum with a small configuration where you could have so-called whitelisters that can be custodians, can be banks, and Fireblocks is one of them, and Swiss Figma-regulated SIBA Bank was voted as a second whitelister into the market, where you can set up a private market on a public blockchain ledger to have all the benefits of DeFi, but also mitigating your kind of like a counterparty risk and have more compliant markets. But the very recent progress, I would say that what we have achieved with JP Morgan on a specific deployment where JP Morgan effectively took one of the Aave markets. Obviously, it's an open source protocol, so you can make your own fork and deployment, and they tokenized Singaporean dollars, Japanese yen, and effectively made a live transaction between multiple banks by depositing into the protocol and borrowing liquidity. So by using also this thing called verifiable credentials, where you could verify that you're capable of entering into the market without revealing necessarily some parts of your privacy. And I think that's a big process. So it was very small lift technically, but a big process of actually getting all the buy-ins from different compliance departments, and actually even within our team to focus a bit of time into this deployment, because effectively those kind of small milestones that happen in a smaller markets, they move the needle forward and then inspire other institutions to actually experiment as well. And I think it gives also hope that we don't see two different parallel, and at some point, whether it's TradFi, CFi, DeFi, it all becomes Fi, so it's all finance, right? But the main big difference, and this boils down to the FTX and all the shit that has been happening for the past 6 months, is that some part of finance has to be public infrastructure. So no way we can trust any single figure CEO in the space to basically give their perspective of how much leverage they're taking, and instead we should have a public good infrastructure where you can govern within the community. And the beauty of public goods is that if you don't really have the same consensus of that community, you can actually fork that protocol and create a new community. And this is the beauty of decentralization, that you don't need to have one single Aave market. There could be different kinds of versions for different aims and communities. And that's how you build a financial system that is sound, transparent, and I think it's the future. And it should be like the backbone of whatever financial backend we want to have in the future.
There's maybe one, I think, 2 points I want to add. Like looking at institutions and people in TradFi, 2 years ago, most people interested in, or most people in finance, like if you ask them about crypto, either they were not interested at all, or they just cared about a 100x like opportunity, like, oh, this is maybe my ticket to the moon, but right, like that was probably the extent. I think over the last 2 years, and Sonny just showed us like how damn early we are. Like stablecoins less than 4 years. DeFi as a term was in 2019. DeFi summer 2020, right? But like over the last 2 years, we have gotten, I think, to a point of no return where when you now talk to these people in finance today, they're actually understanding that DeFi it's not just some technology stock that they're investing in, but it's actually fundamentally going to change the infrastructure that banks use today. That actually may be similar to now being able to order food online instead of having to call using an app, right? Like with DeFi, you can actually do these transactions, and like for the end user, maybe for the retail early DeFi user, some of these things that I'm going to be talking about that institutions really care about sound extremely boring. But for these large banks, it's extremely, like the processes they use to like account for interest, to make sure that transactions are settled correctly, to like figure out like if just 2 counterparties are doing a transaction and then there's like 2 legal departments, 2 compliance departments, 2 accounting departments that are going to settle this transaction, right? That versus being able to go into a DeFi protocol and being able to say, well, like there's a blockchain. It gives you the dApp gives you an interest rate that you're paying. The token transfer settles the transaction, and through that you probably get rid of about 100 people in a transaction, or 100 different kind of like things that are all manual, right? And this is really, really. It sounds simple, but it's a huge difference that it makes to all of these like old school legacy paper contract like kind of settled products that like we're really like replacing one by one. And I think this is where like we need to, well, there's obviously huge like hundreds of people in their legal departments, thousands of people in every single department that we kind of like need to convince that this is a better way to do it. So these small steps forward are what gets us there, but ultimately. I think once we set this in motion, this is going to change the world of finance as we know it.
Yeah.
So boring is good.
Yeah.
Sorry, maybe just to add to that, it's I think what's exciting about DeFi is there's a massive unlock from like a societal perspective, but actually also underneath that, if you look at the fundamentals of the technology, that's a massive step change too. So like seemingly simple things like 24/7 markets, self-custody, instant settlement, and then arguably one of the biggest, which is, to Lucas's point, around the efficiency of the market that you can create. Like why employ thousands of people to create an exchange when you can have a smart contract do it all autonomously to infinity? And that is and kind of what that means, right, is if you employ thousands of people, you have to pay them. Which means you have to charge fees, which is massive rent extraction out of the creation of the exchange, whereas a smart contract, in theory, has a kind of way lower rent extraction and therefore kind of massively more efficient creation of the market.
One thing I want to talk about is with the adoption, because like I personally think UX in DeFi is relatively like easy, but it's just like the kind of like use cases, and with the streaming payments and basically salaries and like what we have to do kind of like is to swap the current like backend of the internet banking system into something that is decentralized is the way to go. And I think that's where we see a lot of onboarding basically on streaming payments as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of onboarding difficulties. And I think one thing that as a protocol and as a DeFi community we should focus on is not build yet another technical solution that is similar to the other. And if you look at the TradFi space, why Swift is globally success is not because how they deliver the message, but the message itself to standardize. I mean, we're talking about open protocol here, so how much effort we have been putting into defining the standard message in order to, let's say, in streaming case, in the Superfluid case, we want to standardize the payment as a message, and we want to be able to send the message interoperable, send across different chains, right? It's not building another bridge. I mean, there's a lot of saga and fiasco regarding different bridge got hacked. But if we could standardize those messages wouldn't die. Infrastructure might have hacked, might die, but if we can put more efforts into getting more project involved so that the stuff we build, especially the message, can be reused later, I think that's going to be very beneficial, going to be community-wide efforts. And I think one thing I would also add to the DeFi in general is now we're going to have a lot of fires around us because of the fiasco related to the FTX. It's to quote our frenemy, Charles Hoskinson, right? So he says that it's time for the DeFi as an industry to live up to the thing on its label, which is decentralized finance. I think, including us, I mean, many projects still has a centralized admin key or this kind of thing. Many good projects like Aave and Uniswap doesn't have this anymore, right? But we have a lot of projects will be criticized that there is a still centralized component. I think it's time for the DeFi project to live up to the true promise so that we can move forward as a community. One joke that I always like to mention is that we all agree DeFi is the future, but we always say that we will do the DeFi in the future, right? So we should do it now, not in the future. Right?
And so in the sort of with the idea of doing it now, and I've got Vinay looking at me very angrily, but the timer didn't start. So I think in 1 minute, we all talk about the fact that sort of DeFi is it's programmable, it's permissionless, it's trustless, but also it's composable. And so we've got sort of 4 great founders here of different protocols. And if any one of you could talk about what could be an application that you could build with all 4 or 3 or 2 of the protocols, that anyone in the world, a developer could say, OK, I'm going to use these protocols without asking for your permission and just build something on top of it. Do you have sort of any ideas that you could throw out there, for example?
There are a lot of applications being built on top of the Aave protocol because I do believe that one protocol could do something very well, and especially as more capital comes in, there's stakes are higher, so the teams usually try to laser focus more on what's important. I mean, Volt is basically using also Aave protocol, and it's pretty much everything is like somehow combined. We even use Superfluid and in actually many places as well, and streaming basic DAO payments and whatnot. But I think it's like I've been forcing people to build for the past couple of years. So I think I want to send a kind of like a message is that whatever is something that actually could help and make impact with using this kind of like a new financial system is very important. And I've seen a lot of value in actually creating payments applications. And the reason is why a few years ago we tried to do this within the DeFi community, and we realized that paying for a beer in a bar and waiting for 5 minutes and paying more for the transaction cost than your beer is worth will not make sense. I don't know, maybe it will make sense in Finland or Switzerland where the prices are higher on beer, but still it's not very scalable. So what I think now with layer 2s, what is fascinating is that you can start transaction more. So with, for example, interest rate swaps, you can actually close positions more frequently. And what you can actually do now, first time ever, you can start building applications to actually replace the current internet payment system. End of the day, there's 5 billion users on the internet. They're using Stripe or whatnot. They take 2 to 3% fees. Same with credit card providers. There's a lot of things we can do better and mitigate a lot of risk as well. And actually, we can have traceability with money. So one of the things we're doing at Aave, we're building a stablecoin that is named Go. And the idea with the stablecoin is that we're trying to kind of like push the narrative outside of decentralized finance and actually see something happen where we're trying to actually make it very easy to use stablecoins on online payments and see people to build on top of the infrastructure and building payment applications. Why it's so important as well is that there is also real-life problems where we're living now in an economy where the inflation is spiking from 5 to 10 to even 15%. You go to Argentina, the inflation is there, 100% almost. So you have half of the purchasing power next year, and it's a vicious cycle. So Argentinians, for example, they're looking into stable coins to actually being able to preserve the value that they earn. But same, for example, people who are here in Finland, for them, a decentralized ecosystem could be an opportunity and creates equal access to everyone for the same financial opportunity, but also it creates transparency. So what if you actually want to use money where you actually know how the money is used? How much of that particular stablecoin is used for impact, for example? How much it actually reduces carbon? You couldn't do that in the past because you can't track dollars. But with the blockchain, it's a perfect use case where you can actually start tracing and tracking impact as well. And I think that's important to realize because Slush is an extremely fascinating event because whatever technology we're building, whether it's AI or whether it's blockchain or robotics, we always think here about the impact, and that's the way to actually sell these protocols to the bigger audiences. Like how we build something that is better than the current money and ecosystem we have. Because to be honest, somehow finance is working today. There might be banks that go down, but they get bailed out. So it works some way. There's partially big inflation, but it comes down at some point. So you have to give more value on what we're building on a kind of like a larger vision. And I think that's what I recommend to build more impact.
Very cool. I think that's a no-go on any more answers. So thank you very much to all four of you, and I hope to continue the conversation afterwards.